And, you know, anytime I would mention it to him, he would say, well, my kids don't live here. My kids don't live here. My kids don't live here. Well, that doesn't matter. You know, that's not how my kids see it. And then he would talk to my kids in a way that would, you know, like make them feel like complete shit about themselves. He was always in drill sergeant mode, you know, like he was always looking for a reason for them to be in trouble about something. It didn't matter what it was. He was always looking for a reason. One night, after the kids went to bed, and he was finally ready to eat, he went into the kitchen and got a dish out of the drainer, and it had a little piece of food stuck on it. He actually wanted to go wake up my daughters, who at the time were in 2nd and 3rd grade, and who were already asleep. This was, I don't know, 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. And they had school the next morning also. And he wanted to wake them up and make them rewash all of those dishes. Because if they didn't get that one clean, they didn't get the rest of them clean. Needless to say, I flipped my shit. We got in a huge fight. Another time, he went into my son's room for the sole purpose of bitching about how dirty his room was. And he demanded that he get off of his game right this minute and clean it. And, you know, when Jake protested, Josh got angry. And he tried to take him outside. Like, to fight. I'm sorry, but a kid having a clean bedroom is not so important to me that I'm willing to go in and start a literal fight with them. Like, no. It's not worth it to me. You know, their home was more like a prison when it was supposed to be their sanctuary. You know, they couldn't ever relax at home. Josh wouldn't let them. He liked to make them look at the wall when they were in trouble, because we didn't have enough open corners to put them in a corner. So he would make them look at the wall. One day, I walked in from work, and all 3 of my kids were looking at the wall with their arms stretched out like this. That was their punishment for not doing their chores correctly. They weren't allowed to put their arms down. I flipped my shit when I walked in and saw what was happening. And, you know, hindsight, I should have kicked his ass out that day. And since then, I've told him that. I should have kicked his ass out that day, but I didn't. Another time, not long before we got divorced, he was mad at the girls because they weren't doing the dishes and I wasn't making them. By this point, they were in high school, you know. They were teenagers, and he'd made them do enough in their life, and, you know, I told him that. So his solution was to not let them use any of the dishes. He took every dish in the house and he moved it to a shelf in our sunroom, which is where we hung out a lot. Our dogs lived in the sunroom, and we had it set up like a living room. And he put them on a shelf back there. And when I saw it, oh God, I flipped my shit that day too. And I made him move every dish back. You know, he wanted to instill his mother's, you know, 1950s way of raising children, and I just simply wasn't having it. You know, and I could tell you many more stories just like that one. All we ever really argued about was how he treated my kids, until closer to the end, when we started arguing more about his drinking. He also had a friend with us that lived with us for 3 years, rent-free. And he was just as bad, if not worse, than my husband was. At first, it was okay because he cooked and cleaned. And it was kind of nice coming home to a clean house and dinner, But as time went on, he would just get more and more drunk. And then, once he started drinking Josh's beers, it became a race. Because Josh wasn't going to have him drinking more of his own beer than he was. One day, he left the grill on, and he burned up my bushes out front. Could have burnt my house down. One night, he left the water on in the tub all night, because he'd went in, turned the water on, and then went back to his room and passed out. You can imagine how high that water bill was. He started making mac and cheese one night. And my daughter told me that she smelled something burning, and she went to the kitchen and discovered that he'd left his noodles boiling on the stove. And that by the time she found it, all the water had evaporated and the noodles were scorched in the bottom of my $50 pan. And, when you live like that, your nervous system never really turns off. I'm gonna get a drink. Your nervous system never really turns off, and you're always watching. You're always responsible, and you're always making sure everything's going smoothly because you have to. Because it's literally a matter of life and death. I mean, the number of times that my house could have been burnt to the ground with all of us in it. And if all of that wasn't enough, my husband didn't have a license for 20 whole years, okay? He didn't have a license, which meant I had to drive everywhere. Well, after his accident, he drove for a long time, illegally. And then one night, we had been out at the V Club for 80s night. And we had both been drinking too much. And I will admit my guilt here as well. He left a little bit before I did because he'd had enough. And on the way home, he ran his van into a tree. Now, like I said, I'll admit I was drinking too much to be driving as well. But I do know my limit, and I would have never driven home if I didn't think for a second that I could make it. He never knew his limit. Never. So, I'd been trying to call him when I was leaving, and he didn't answer. So I tried just, taking the same route that I thought he would take home. And turns out he didn't answer because he plowed his car into a tree. So he broke his sternum. The brake pedal went into his shin. So imagine this is his shin, right? It went in under the skin and came out, and like right below the knee, which would be right here, and then it went up and got another chunk of meat out of his other leg, up close to his area. Not to mention he totaled the van, right? So he had to rip his leg off of the pedal before he could even get out of the car. And then, because he'd been drinking and he had no license, he thought it was a good idea to run. So he drank so much and was in such shock that, he didn't even realize that he had this giant hole in his leg. And, it hadn't really occurred to him that he just, ripped his leg off with the brake pedal. Once he realized that, and he realized that he was bleeding, pretty profusely, he left his hiding place, and he surrendered, and and they took him to the hospital. So from that point on, every grocery trip, every school drop-off, every appointment, every time he ran out of cigarettes or beer, every game for his son, I had to do it. On top of nursing him back to health. And, I didn't just go do these things. I dragged my kids along with me. And, more often than not, they were hungry. They were tired. They had not done their homework. They hadn't had showers, and, I felt bad asking my mom to keep them while I, Mom, can you keep my kids while I go watch his kid play? Like, that's kind of crappy. So I would drag them along with me, and, they would be miserable. But anyway, I even would get up early and take him to work after he, finally went back to work. I would get up early. He'd have to be at work at 6 o'clock every morning, and I would take him to work. Now, he'd have to walk home, but I had to take him to work. Everything revolved around his life. Everything was to make his life easier, although he would beg to differ. About 10 years into our relationship, I started talking about trying to get his license back. Casually mentioning it, that he should find out how much his fines are, and, let's start paying those. Let's make up, some payment arrangements, right? Well, 4 years later, I gave up and just started making calls myself. I spent hours on the phone, okay, tracking down 20-year-old tickets, setting up payment arrangements, and then making sure they actually got paid. Like me, I did that because he wouldn't do it. His life was too easy. Then he had to do DUI school, which was $500 out of pocket. And he had to do this twice because he failed his drug test at the end of the first one. Not because of drugs, but because of alcohol. Turns out when you're in DUI school and they do those drug tests, they test you for alcohol too. Bet you didn't know that. He didn't. And it didn't stop there. When we got together, he didn't even make enough money to support his own habits. Like, he worked part-time as a busboy at Chili Willie's before they shut down. Okay? Then a third of his paycheck was taken for child support, which still wasn't enough to fulfill the obligation. So he was going in debt every month. And then it would cost me money to keep him around.